and perhaps stretching and challenging ourselves to say, how do we more deeply live into these values? And today's value is taken from the idea that we say that community is the center of our life. And that's a pretty mysterious and maybe so general that it could be interpreted in many different ways. So I wondered how traditional, conservative, or if you go back in time, Mennonites might live out that vision of community being the center of their life. And so we would know this, right? And so sometimes this is what happens when you tell folks in an urban context that you are Mennonite. They would be like, wait a minute, but is there like a colony, a closed kind of knit community of folks that are here? And we'd say, well, no, not exactly. Although close-knit, small community, I mean, that's an ingredient of it. And the more I thought about even the traditional, because I'm very principle-driven, I don't need you to tell me how to do things. I just love to get, to what are the principles, what are the values, and then how do we put that into our context? So many of these things I thought are so desperately needed in the 21st century in an urban environment here in the city of Atlanta. The need for a small, close-knit community of belonging. Now, perhaps on the dark side of it is that it was exclusionary, right? You had to be inside the fold, but what we're reading and what we were hearing today in terms of the body and what we were seeing today or singing about today in terms of being strangers no more, we see that the Spirit is saying actually the sense of community should be inclusive, should be embracing, should be crossing borders. Mutual aid would be something that traditionally Mennonites would say, this is evidence that community is the center of our life. The way in which we don't just dispense charity, but the ways in which we work together towards mutuality, towards interdependency, towards reciprocity. It was perhaps easier to do community in those types of ways because traditionally Mennonites would have lived in proximity to one another. And so even now, I am still drawn, as you all know, to intentional forms of community. Perhaps my introduction to Anabaptism happened unawares as I was first drawn to the radical intentional Christian communities here in Georgia, like Jubilee Partners and Koinonia Farm and the Open Door community. So what does it mean when we, Atlanta Mennonite Church, say that we are making community the center of our life? What does it mean in our context? What does the word community even mean nowadays? It's like many words that once held a deep, rich meaning. We now use them casually, don't we? Like the word love. Like I love everything. Perhaps it's the limitations of the English language. But what does community mean? Is community found in social media? Talk about the communities that I belong to. Are they virtual? Are they proximate? Are they distant? What does the word community even mean nowadays? And to say that it's the center of our life, there's a whole mystery that we can unpack. What does centered mean nowadays when we live a hurried, rat-raced, uncentered life? Perhaps even intentionally designed to be so. We were distracted. So what does it even mean to have anything, much less community, at the center of our life? Well, I want to give you just what I think are some principles that help us to understand what it could mean to be a 21st century Anabaptist witness in the city of Atlanta that says community is the center of our life. And I'm going to use an acronym for center. So C, a community is a place where we are a circle of belonging, a fellowship, a place where we find support, where we get to practice not only mutual aid, but even more radical forms of mutual aid. Again, how do we serve one another in ways that foster mutuality and reciprocity and empowerment? I think of the example, all of us have been walking up and we've seen the new gates that are out here. Maybe now you've been walking into the bathroom and you're like, oh, the light turns on by itself. But what you might not realize is that behind the scenes of that is a practice of mutual aid. And that is that Albert, one of the residents at Casa Alterna, who's originally from Venezuela, who he and his family, soon to be a family of 7, are seeking asylum here. And you could say that they are dependent upon us. But we have embraced them and enfolding them. They are part of the afternoon congregation that is here. That's a reciprocal relationship. But what we are doing with Albert is saying, Albert, you have gifts, and we are calling out those gifts in you. He is an artist, a craftsman, and has extreme talents and gifts. And yes, you have a need, but so do we. So it reminds me of Jesus, with the Samaritan woman, when Jesus says, I thirst, give me something to drink. And we're coming to Albert and saying, you're not just going to be a recipient of our charity, but we thirst. We have a need for your presence. We have a need for your gifts. And so he's been doing a lot of craftsmanship around the campus. And in return, what we're doing is we're building up an escrow account to help his family when it comes time for legal needs or medical needs or what have you. It's a wonderful example of mutual aid. So much so that, Sam and Bakafa were at the house last night as we were celebrating just life together, but celebrating also the birthday of their daughter, of Albert's daughter, and just that life together and the relationships that have come as even Albert and Bakafa have done work together. But community also engages in worship. In the book of Acts, we heard the story about how it was a community devoted to prayer and the breaking of bread. If we are community-centered, we are an intimate gathering of people. I had one of our most recent guests, who's not here today, but one of our recent guests came up to me afterwards and said, in a very complimentary way, this kind of felt like a 12-step group. Meaning that what he observed was a sense of belonging and a sense of intimacy and even a sense of vulnerability, which might not be for everyone, but he meant that in the most affirming way. So worship involves that sense of vulnerability and intimacy before God and one another. Worship is simple in an Anabaptist perspective. Worship has a biblical emphasis, so you're always going to hear Scripture being read. You're always going to hear kind of Scripture even anchoring much of what happens on a Sunday morning. And there's always going to be the breaking of bread. Not just as a social act, not just as an act that we do because we just want to enjoy community, but because it is a sacred act. It is the time when we are invited, perhaps we don't often remember that, but we're invited to see that of God within everyone. Community is also a place where we get to nurture relationships. What we seek here is unity, not uniformity. Right? I remember that sometimes was hard for me. Honestly, with y'all, when I first got to hang out with Mennonites, it was after the war in Iraq, and I was looking for a church that was devoted to nonviolence. And I remember that I went to the Southeast Conference gathering. It was down in South Florida. It was my first time connecting with a broader group of Mennonites outside of the Georgia congregations, and I was perplexed. I was perplexed because it was election season, and Mennonites had yard signs of candidates that were not advocating for a peace position. And it just struck me. So one of the things, though, that I had to realize is that unity is not uniformity, because I remember one time in this space, to show you how my theology changes, saying, I wonder what it would look like if a church would reach consensus about who to vote for or not vote at all. What we seek as we nurture relationships with one another is unity and not uniformity. I was just at a memorial service yesterday for a Quaker friend. That might be redundant, but for a Quaker who is a friend. And it was beautiful to hear the witnessing. I think we say that as Mennonites, we are open to the Spirit, but I don't think there's anyone more open to the Spirit than unprogrammed Quakers, as anyone could share in this funeral service, in this memorial service. But the thing that was beautiful was, while this person had deep convictions, even so far as to be deeply, deeply a fanatic of Ohio State's football team, and someone pointed out that the memorial service was happening at the same time as the Ohio State football game and found that to be ironic. That person also had the tremendous capacity to accept differences and to seek unity over uniformity. And it was a beautiful witness. I think all of us, I was telling this to Becky, should have a mock funeral. Maybe we should have a mock funeral for Atlanta Mennonite Church and wonder what would be said of us. It could be an opportunity for us as a personal inventory, much less as a corporate inventory, to say, what do we want our witness to be? And when I think about nurturing relationships, I think about the fact that at the core of my hospitality, the core of my gifts, the core of my charisms, is that I seek to nurture relationships across borders. Becky shared an email and gave me permission to read this email this morning about the ways in which, when we know we have a community that we can belong to, that we can reach out to for support, where we can find gladness and sincerity and generosity and vulnerability. So Becky sent all of us an email. If you didn't get this, let us know, and we'll make sure you're on the listserv. But Becky thanked us. She said, I want to thank you for your prayers and well wishes for our family this week. On Wednesday, we thought we were saying goodbye to Mom. We spent an hour singing hymns, praying, crying, and hugging in Mom's room in her assisted living. She hadn't eaten or had any water in days. She couldn't lift her head and wasn't verbal. We only got occasional eye contact and grunts for communication. This is an intimate moment. I mean, I remember like when Arturo and Norma, for those of you who know, they are my family, and they were part of our community, and remember being with them when Norma would have congestive heart failure. And I remember one time Arturo taking his phone and playing a song that she loved and putting it to her ear and brushing her hair. And I felt like I shouldn't be there. I felt like it was too intimate for me to be in that space. This letter was shared because you are a community that nurtures Becky. And she continued, though, and said, Wednesday evening, my brother asked her what she thought of her family singing, and she said the first word she had spoken in days: wonderful. Thursday morning, the hospice nurse met with me to discuss the signs she was seeing of Mom's body shutting down. But, and God's always in the but, Thursday she had an incredible day. The aides got her up and gave her a shower and washed her hair. By the evening, when family was gathered for pizza in the private dining room, she said she wanted to come join us. She fed herself pizza, salad, garlic bread, and banana pudding! Exclamation point. I've never seen anything like it. We don't know how long this will last. But for now, she has decided that she is determined to squeeze out more days of living. Karen told Mom that we were all fearing that we needed to say goodbye on Wednesday. She told Karen, it was not my time. But there was community centered around her life in that place. When we say the community is the center of our life, we're also talking about togetherness and growth. I have lived in intentional community. As you all know, I lived at that experiment for 15 years, and I will tell you this, that togetherness and growth was not utopian. It was hard. It was filled with conflict. There were days that I was like, why am I doing this? But I can tell you that in the sum total of that story, that for everyone who invested in that community, not just who was a spectator, not just who was on the periphery of it, but for everyone who invested in that community, we were better human beings. Yuri Brafenbrenner, psychologist, says that healthy human development is a balance of challenge and support. In togetherness, in deep togetherness, sometimes community gives us the painful gift of a mirror, and it's challenging. But a healthy community wraps itself around you with gracious support at the same time. We have another single woman at Casa Alterna right now. She will be giving birth to her first child in November, and we had a baby shower for her recently. And we had folks from within the house and folks from an Episcopal church who have formed her care circle come, and boy, the care circle like made really fancy desserts and had games, and I mean it was a major baby shower. And she had come from a culture where she had never even witnessed a baby shower, never had the resources to have a baby shower, and so this was so special for her. And then the gifts came, and she opened the gifts in front of everyone, and in her broken English she looked around at everyone and said, "I love you. I love you." She is growing through the pain and trauma that made her leave her country, through the pain and trauma that resulted in her having conceived a child, to the pain and trauma of living in an unknown place, arriving in Atlanta unhoused. That house is not easy. It's hard. Ask anyone who lives there, and y'all know Lloyda. It's not easy. But if they stick to it, they will see that they are growing. If we keep community at the center of our life, though, we also have the wonderful opportunity, again, to not only express love of neighbor, but also to express love for God. And not just neighbor who is closest to us. Jesus dispels the myth of who is our neighbor in terms of who's the person who's homogeneous, who's most like us. Jesus dispels that and says, no, if community is the center of your life, it is not just contained to this group. It must go outward. And so today you see I'm wearing keffiyeh in solidarity with the people of Palestine. I was in Palestine in 2009, and that's where I got this, and I got to meet and spend time with Naeem Atik, who is the founder of Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center. Has anyone here ever heard of Naeem Atik or met Naeem? I would imagine you would. Naeem and their witness there with Sabeel has always inspired me. He would talk about how Jesus suffers even today when there are political systems of repression and oppression. And he would grieve about how innocent Palestinians and innocent Israelis fall victim to these policies and systems of oppression and repression. And of course, being in Jerusalem, he would use the language of saying that even today, Jesus is walking the Via Dolorosa. That Jesus is the powerless Palestinian who is humiliated at a checkpoint. That Jesus is the woman trying to get to the hospital for treatment. That Jesus is the young man whose dignity is getting trampled. That Jesus is the young student who cannot get to university to study. That Jesus is the unemployed father who needs to find bread to feed his family. And then Atik would also say that there are 4 things that are clear today. One is that Jerusalem still does not know what makes for peace. that Jesus is weeping and that his tears are mixed with many other people's tears, that the number of people who are carrying their crosses are multiplying phenomenally. And the women of Palestine, as well as many Jewish women, are weeping over the many killed and wounded innocents. But when Charles and I traveled to Palestine in 2009 for our 15th wedding anniversary, we learned a lot of different things. One, I learned that Anton is a pretty common name for Palestinian Christians, men. And that I also learned why why washing feet was an important thing, because we received hospitality. We were welcomed into the community of care of a Palestinian shepherd family in Atwani. And you sit at the floor, barefoot, with your feet close to your food. So I appreciated that there was a foot washing. I also learned through that family and through their children who were children shepherds, why David might have gotten bored easily watching sheep as I joined their children one afternoon. And I also got to see what military repression looks like. When community is the center of our life, we also get to practice radical generosity. Soon we'll be discussing what do we do with kind of our surplus budget. And I want to challenge us and say, what is it that we can only do together? What is it that I can't do by myself, but that we can only do together? I love the paradox of radical generosity. I love the fact that when we give ourselves away, we are blessed. That when we give, we learn to dispel the myth of scarcity. That when we share the loaves and fishes, we find that there's more than enough for everyone. And so I want us to practice radical generosity, but practice it in a way that we say, what can we only do together that we can't do alone? You see, I can write a check to a nonprofit, but from my experience with Alterna, I realized that only together could we help build a house or build a school in Guatemala. Even our small community of 15 people were able to do 4 Habitat houses, add on to a school, and do road improvement. We could do that together. We could not have done that alone. You know, I can join our partners this Wednesday on the property and help with the native plants to prosper. But I, by myself, can't single-handedly partner with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light and make this campus a climate change resiliency hub, a vision that Cody shared with me. Yeah, I can teach, and various of us can teach about watershed discipleship, but I can't adopt Sugar Creek by myself. I can't by myself create affordable housing and preserve the nature of this property that we steward. And I'd rather not work by myself to try to seek justice at the Capitol, all these things within our watershed. When we look at the cross, may that be a symbol of what a cruciformed community looks like. Where the vertical beam says, this is our place of worship where we come to love God. And that the horizontal beam says, and this is the place where we come to love one another in ever stretching ways. As I said, when I invited an immigrant family with significant medical needs to share life with us, to become our neighbor, when I took the equity of my home and said, I will buy a second home for you to live in and will never make any landlord profit, and instead will share that equity with you. When I made that invitation, the invitation was also one of reciprocity and said, my son is from Guatemala. I need you to help my child and all of us understand more about our cultural identity. I need you to enrich my life with your gifts and your presence. And what I realized is that they didn't understand language of intentional community, but they understood familia. They understood family. If community is the center of our life, then we are becoming one another's adopted family. Amen.
During the next hymn, you're welcome to bring your offerings forward to the table. Turn to page 797.